There are clay tablets buried beneath the deserts of Iraq that should not exist. They were written more than 5,000 years ago, long before Greece, long before Rome, before the Bible, before almost everything we call recorded history. Yet when archaeologists finally translated them, they found something strange. Stories of gods who came from the sky, kings who ruled before the Great Flood, and descriptions of knowledge that feels disturbingly modern. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, even strange references to machines. For centuries, these tablets sat silently beneath ruined cities. Nineveh or Eridu, places so ancient that their names had become myth. Then, in the 19th century, explorers digging through the dust of Mesopotamia began uncovering thousands of them. Small clay rectangles, covered in wedge-shaped markings pressed into wet mud thousands of years ago. At first, no one could read them. They looked like scratches, random marks, meaningless symbols. But they were not random. They were writing. The earliest writing humanity ever created. A script now called cuneiform. And once scholars finally cracked the code, the tablets began to speak. What they revealed would change our understanding of ancient civilization. Because these tablets did not describe a primitive world just learning to survive. They described cities, libraries, astronomers mapping the heavens, priests recording events older than any known civilization, and stories so strange that even today, historians argue about what they mean. Some say they are mythology. Others believe they are exaggerated memories of real events. And a few insist the tablets describe something else entirely. Something humanity has forgotten. Because hidden among the stories of kings and floods are passages that raise an unsettling question. What if the earliest civilization we know was not the first? What if the Sumerians themselves believed their knowledge came from somewhere else? To understand that mystery, we have to travel back to the very beginning, to the land between two rivers, where the first cities rose from the mud, and where thousands of clay tablets waited, buried beneath the ruins of a forgotten world. Long before Egypt built the pyramids, another civilization had already risen. It appeared in a land the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Every year those rivers flooded the surrounding plains. When the water receded, it left behind rich black soil, perfect for farming, perfect for cities. Around 4000 BC, small farming villages in this region began to grow. Then they grew larger and larger until something extraordinary happened. For the first time in human history, people began living in true cities, not villages, cities. The largest of them was called Uruk. At its height, Uruk may have held 40,000 people. an enormous population for the ancient world. Towering temple platforms rose above the mud-brick streets. Markets bustled with merchants trading grain, wool, pottery, and copper. Priests observed the stars from temple rooftops. Engineers carved canals through the land to control the river floods. And scribes sat patiently beside baskets of wet clay, pressing symbols into the surface with sharpened reeds. Those symbols became the first true writing system, cuneiform. At first, the marks were simple: records of grain, lists of livestock, trade accounts. But over time, the writing evolved. The symbols multiplied, hundreds of them, then thousands. Soon the tablets were no longer just keeping records. They were telling stories, recording laws, describing kings, mapping the stars, writing poems, even recording arguments between priests and philosophers. Entire libraries of clay tablets were stored inside temples and palaces. Thousands of them, stacked in rooms like ancient archives. Some tablets were copies of much older texts that scribes believed were already ancient in their own time. And this is where the mystery begins to deepen. Because among the ordinary records of trade and agriculture were tablets that described something far older than the cities themselves. Stories of beings called the Anunnaki, gods who, according to the texts, descended from the heavens. They were said to have shaped the world, guided kings, and passed knowledge to humanity. Most historians read these passages as mythology, but others point to something stranger. The Sumerians were capable astronomers. Their tablets mapped the movements of planets with surprising accuracy. They described constellations, eclipses, and the cycles of Venus, all written in clay more than 4,000 years ago. How a civilization this early developed such complex knowledge remains a subject of debate. But the tablets do not stop there, because among the oldest Sumerian texts are stories that echo across many later cultures. Stories of a catastrophic flood, stories of divine beings walking among humans, stories that would eventually appear again in Babylonian myths, in Greek legends, and even in the pages of the Bible. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if many of the stories we think we understand actually began here, in the cities of Sumer? Written into clay tablets thousands of years before most of history even began. For a long time, historians believed the tablets would contain simple things: trade records, crop tallies, lists of grain and livestock. That assumption lasted until scholars began translating them. What they found was far stranger. The earliest written records in human history were not primitive at all. They were already organized, already mathematical, already describing systems that look surprisingly advanced. Some tablets recorded legal codes. Others mapped the movement of planets. There were astronomical observations, mathematical tables, medical instructions, engineering notes, and long narrative stories. Stories about kings, about gods, about floods, about creation. In other words, the very first written civilization did not begin with simple survival notes. It began with something much larger, a culture that already believed the world was ordered, measured, observed, recorded. And that raises a question historians still debate today. If writing was only just invented, how did the Sumerians already have so much to write about? Because knowledge like this does not appear overnight. Mathematics takes generations. Astronomy takes centuries of watching the sky. Engineering requires experimentation, trial, failure, improvement. Yet the moment writing appears in Sumer, all of it seems to already exist. One tablet lists detailed star observations. Another shows a mathematical system based on the number 60. That system is the reason we still divide time the way we do today. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees in a circle. The fingerprints of Sumer are still embedded in the way we measure the universe. And the tablets continue. Thousands of them, buried in the ruins of cities like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Nippur. When archaeologists began uncovering these cities in the 19th century, they expected to find the scattered remains of an early society. What they uncovered instead looked more like the records of an already mature civilization. Cities, law codes, mathematics, astronomy, literature, religion. It was as if history had skipped the opening chapter, as if humanity's first written civilization had appeared already fully formed. And that brings us to one of the strangest documents ever discovered among those tablets, a document that historians still struggle to explain. It is called the Sumerian King List. And if the translations are correct, the rulers recorded on that list did not reign for decades. They ruled for thousands of years, some for tens of thousands. Among the thousands of tablets uncovered in Mesopotamia, one stands apart. It is known today as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it looks simple. A list of rulers, city by city, dynasty by dynasty, the earliest kings of humanity. But when historians began translating the text, something did not make sense. The reigns were impossibly long, not decades, not even centuries. Thousands of years. The very first king listed is a ruler named Alulim. According to the tablet, he ruled the city of Eridu. His reign lasted 28,800 years. The next king ruled for 36,000 years. Another ruled for 43,200 years. And it continues like this. King after king, reigning for lengths of time no human life could ever sustain. At first, historians assumed the numbers must be symbolic, perhaps a myth, perhaps a mistake in translation. But then something stranger appears in the middle of the tablet. A single line, a dividing moment in history. The text simply says, "Then the flood swept over the land." After that line, everything changes. The reign lengths suddenly shrink. Kings begin ruling for hundreds of years, then decades. Then something closer to normal human lifespans. It is as if the tablet describes two different ages of the world. One before the flood, one after. And the cities change as well. Before the flood, the kings rule places like Eridu, Bad Tibira, and Shuruppak, cities that archaeologists now know were among the earliest settlements in southern Mesopotamia. After the flood, power shifts. New cities appear. Kish, Uruk, Ur. Places that would later become some of the greatest urban centers of the ancient world. The tablet does not explain the change. It simply records it. A list of kings. A catastrophic flood. Then a new era of rulers. To modern historians, the explanation is usually practical. Perhaps the early numbers were symbolic. Perhaps the scribes exaggerated the past. Perhaps the kings represented dynasties rather than individuals. But even with those explanations, the mystery remains. Why did the very first historians of civilization choose to begin their record this way? Why describe a world ruled by figures whose lifetimes stretched across tens of thousands of years? And why place a great flood in the center of that story? Because the flood is not unique to Sumer. Versions of the same event appear across ancient cultures. In Mesopotamia, in the Hebrew Bible, in Greek mythology, even in stories from distant civilizations. Different names, different heroes, but the same pattern. A catastrophic flood that resets the world. And the Sumerian tablets record it long before many of those other traditions were written, which leaves us with an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the earliest scribes of civilization were not inventing legends. Perhaps they believed they were preserving memories. Memories of an older world, a world that existed before the flood. And if that world existed, then the question becomes even stranger. Where did those first kings come from? The tablets do not only describe kings, they also describe beings. Beings who ruled before kings ever appeared. In Sumerian writing, they are called the Anunnaki. The word is usually translated as those who came from the heavens. And this is where the story begins to change, because the tablets do not describe them like ordinary gods. They describe them like rulers, commanders, engineers, beings who arrived, built cities, created systems, and then taught humanity how to live inside them. According to the oldest texts, the Anunnaki came down from the sky and established order on Earth. They founded cities like Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur. Each city had a temple. Each temple belonged to a specific god, and each god ruled like a governor over the land. The tablets described these gods holding councils, arguing, making decisions about humanity, dividing territories between themselves. It reads less like mythology and more like administration. One tablet describes a time before humans existed, a time when the gods themselves had to dig canals, carry stone, build irrigation systems. The work was exhausting. Eventually, the texts say the gods rebelled against the labor. They refused to continue. So a decision was made. Create workers. Create humans. According to the myth, known as the Atrahasis epic, humanity was formed from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. The purpose was simple. Humans would work. The gods would rule. For thousands of years, scholars assumed this was symbolic language, a poetic explanation for agriculture and civilization. But some researchers began asking a different question. What if the Sumerians were not describing gods, but visitors? Beings who possessed knowledge that early humans did not. Knowledge of astronomy, engineering, mathematics. The same tablets that describe the Anunnaki also describe detailed star charts, precise planetary movements, and mathematical systems that were far ahead of their time. The Sumerians knew the orbital cycles of several planets. They understood complex geometry. They built irrigation systems that turned desert land into fertile farmland. All of this appeared suddenly, almost as if knowledge had been handed to them. This is where the modern mystery begins. Because if the Sumerians were inventing mythology, they chose very unusual details. Gods who arrive. Gods who rule cities. Gods who argue like political leaders. Gods who create humans to work for them. And then, slowly, the gods leave. By the time later, civilizations inherited Sumerian culture, the Anunnaki were already becoming distant figures. Legends, echoes, memories. But the tablets remain. Small pieces of clay, pressed with symbols 5,000 years ago, still telling the same story. That long before recorded history, someone or something was already here. Long before modern historians began studying the tablets, another interpretation began to circulate. It came not from archaeologists, but from readers who believed the tablets were describing something much stranger. According to this interpretation, the Anunnaki did not come to Earth simply to rule. They came here to work, and more specifically, to mine. Several tablets describe the gods laboring in harsh conditions, digging, cutting through rock, extracting resources from the ground. One group of texts speaks about a class of gods called the Igigi. These lesser gods were tasked with the physical labor of the heavens. They worked in mines. They dug canals. They moved stone and earth. But eventually, According to the tablets, something happened. The Igigi rebelled. They refused to continue the work. They surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, one of the chief gods of the Anunnaki, and they demanded relief. The tablets describe a crisis. The gods had come to Earth for something valuable, something buried beneath the ground. But the beings tasked with retrieving it no longer agreed to do the work. So the Anunnaki made a decision. If the workers would not continue, they would create new ones. One tablet describes the moment in unsettling detail. A goddess named Ninhursag, sometimes called the Mother of Life, was instructed to form a new being. She mixed clay from the earth with the essence of a god. The result was something entirely new. A creature designed not to rule, not to command, but to labor. The tablets call this new being Lulu. Later translations simply call them humans. In this version of the story, humanity was created for a purpose: to take over the work, to dig, to carry, to extract what the gods had come for. And according to many modern interpretations of these texts, that resource was gold. Gold was rare. Gold was durable. Gold did not corrode. And in the ancient world, gold was associated with the heavens. Some writers have suggested the Anunnaki needed gold to repair the atmosphere of their world. Others believe it was simply the most valuable material available. But the tablets themselves never fully explain the reason. They only describe the outcome. Humans began to work. The mines continued. And the gods stepped back. For thousands of years, this interpretation remained obscure. But in the 20th century, a small group of writers began asking a question that historians usually avoid. What if the tablets were not mythology? What if they were memory? Memory of a civilization so ancient that the line between gods and visitors became blurred. Because one thing is certain: the tablets do not describe humans discovering civilization. They describe humans inheriting it. Cities already existed. Kings already ruled. Knowledge already flowed. And humanity appears suddenly in the middle of the story as workers, which raises a question that still unsettles scholars today. If the Sumerians were the first civilization, why do their own tablets describe the world? As if someone else had arrived first. Long before the story of Noah was written in the Bible, long before the book of Genesis was compiled, another flood story had already been carved into clay. It appears in several Sumerian tablets, most famously in a text known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the story itself is even older than that. Much older. According to the tablets, there came a moment when the gods decided something had gone terribly wrong. Humanity had multiplied. Cities had grown. Noise filled the world. And the gods, the tablets say, could no longer sleep. One text describes the problem with strange clarity. The earth had become too loud, too crowded, too chaotic. The gods began to argue among themselves about what to do. Some believed humans should simply be destroyed. Others hesitated. But eventually, a decision was made. The gods would send a flood, not a local disaster, not a seasonal storm. A flood meant to wipe humanity from the earth entirely. Only one god disagreed. His name was Enki, sometimes called Ea in later versions of the story. Enki was known as the god of wisdom, and according to the tablets, he chose to break the silence. Instead of warning humanity directly, Enki spoke through a dream to a man named Ziusudra. In the later Babylonian version of the story, this man is called Utnapishtim. Enki gave him a simple instruction: build a boat, a large one, seal it with pitch. Bring your family. Bring animals. Bring the seeds of life, because a storm was coming that would erase the world. The tablets describe the moment the flood begins. The sky darkens. Thunder shakes the heavens. Rain falls with a violence the world has never seen. Rivers break their banks. Cities disappear beneath the water. Even the gods themselves grow afraid of the storm they unleashed. One passage describes them hiding in the heavens like frightened animals. The flood lasts for days. Some versions say 7. Others say longer. When the waters finally begin to recede, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. Ziusudra releases birds to search for dry land. A dove, a swallow, and finally a raven. The raven does not return, and the survivor knows the waters have begun to fall. When he steps out of the boat, he offers a sacrifice to the gods. The tablets say the gods gather around the offering, hungry, regretful, because the destruction had nearly erased everything. As a reward for surviving, Ziusudra is granted something extraordinary. Not wealth, not power, but immortality. He is taken far away from the world of ordinary humans, to live forever beyond the edge of history. The story might sound familiar. A divine warning. A great boat. Animals preserved. Birds sent to find land. A survivor chosen to rebuild the world. Thousands of years later, a remarkably similar story appears in the Bible. The story of Noah. But the Sumerian tablets are older, much older, which leaves historians with a difficult question. Did the biblical writers inherit the story from older Mesopotamian traditions, or were both stories remembering something real? A catastrophe so ancient that every civilization carried a version of it, because floods are common in myth. But a flood written into the oldest recorded texts in human history carries a different weight. It means the story existed at the very beginning of written memory, and that raises an uncomfortable possibility. If the Sumerians remembered a flood that reshaped the world, what else might they have remembered that we have dismissed as myth? For a moment, set aside the numbers. Forget the kings ruling for 20,000 years. Focus instead on a single line buried in the middle of the tablets, a sentence so short that it is easy to miss. Yet it may be the most important sentence in the entire Sumerian record. The tablets say, "Then the flood swept over the earth." And after that line, something changes. Before the flood, the kings ruled for thousands of years. After the flood, the reigns become shorter. Hundreds of years. Then decades. Then something that begins to resemble the lifetimes of ordinary human rulers. It is as if the world itself has shifted, as if history has been divided into two chapters. Before the flood and after. The king list even describes what happened next. It says that when the flood ended, kingship descended from heaven once again. Think about that wording. Not kings, not dynasties. Kingship itself, as if the right to rule the earth had been removed and then returned. According to the tablets, the first city to receive kingship after the flood was Kish. From there, it passed to other cities. Uruk, Ur, Lagash. Civilization began again. But here is the strange part. When archaeologists examine these cities, they do not see the slow growth we expect from a primitive culture, learning step by step. Instead, they see something abrupt. Writing appears suddenly. Mathematics appears suddenly. Astronomy appears suddenly. Complex irrigation systems. Legal codes. Organized cities. All appearing within a surprisingly short window of time. Almost as if knowledge arrived already developed. Historians explain this as the natural flowering of the first civilization. And perhaps that is exactly what happened. But the Sumerians themselves left a different memory. They believed civilization had existed before. That the flood did not begin the world, it reset it. And if that is what the tablets are trying to say, then the rise of Sumer may not represent the birth of civilization. It may represent its second beginning, which raises an even stranger possibility. If the Sumerians inherited fragments of knowledge from a world that came before them, then some of the ideas recorded on those clay tablets might not have originated in Sumer at all. They might be echoes, fragments, survivors of something older. And that brings us to another puzzle hidden inside the tablets. Because scattered among the myths and king lists are descriptions of knowledge that feels unexpectedly advanced. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and machines. Knowledge that seems to appear far too early in the historical record. For a long time, historians treated the Sumerians as a beginning, the first writing, the first cities, the first kings. But the tablets contain something stranger than that. They describe knowledge that seems unexpectedly advanced. Not machines, not technology in the modern sense, but understanding. Understanding of the sky, understanding of time, understanding of mathematics, understanding that appears far earlier than we would expect. The Sumerians watched the heavens constantly. Their temples were not only religious centers, they were observation platforms, high places built to study the movement of stars. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation, they recorded the movements of planets. They tracked the cycles of the moon. They predicted eclipses. They mapped the sky with surprising accuracy. Even their system of numbers was unusual. Instead of counting in tens like we do today, the Sumerians counted in 60s, a base 60 system. It sounds strange now, but it survives everywhere in modern life. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. All of that traces back to the mathematics first developed in Mesopotamia over 5,000 years ago. Clay tablets show multiplication tables, division tables, complex calculations, even early algebraic thinking. The Sumerians were not experimenting blindly. They were solving problems, measuring land, tracking planetary cycles, calculating calendars, and building systems that could last across centuries. One tablet, discovered in modern Iraq, is now known as Plimpton 322. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a damaged piece of clay. But when mathematicians studied it more closely, they realized something astonishing. The tablet contains a list of numbers that match the relationships of right-angled triangles, what we now call Pythagorean triples, the same mathematical relationships that would later be taught in Greek geometry. Over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was even born. This does not mean the Sumerians invented modern trigonometry, but it does show something remarkable. They understood patterns in numbers, patterns that describe the geometry of the physical world, patterns that would later become the foundation of engineering, architecture, navigation, and astronomy. And then there is the sky. Many Sumerian tablets describe the movements of celestial bodies, the paths of Venus, the cycles of the moon, the positions of stars across the year. Later, Babylonian astronomers inherited this knowledge and expanded it. They created some of the earliest known astronomical catalogues, lists of constellations, star positions, planetary movements. They could predict eclipses. They could calculate lunar cycles. They could track time across years, all without telescopes, without modern instruments, without lenses. Only observation, patience, and mathematics. Some modern researchers have pushed these discoveries further. They argue that certain tablets contain descriptions of the solar system, planets moving in ordered paths, celestial bodies beyond what could easily be seen. The most famous interpretation comes from writers who claim the Sumerians knew of a distant planet called Nibiru, a wandering body that returned to the inner solar system over long cycles. Mainstream historians reject this interpretation. Most scholars, believed the texts described known planets and mythological ideas about the heavens. But the debate itself reveals something important. The Sumerians were looking at the sky with extraordinary seriousness. They believed the heavens mattered. They believed patterns in the sky meant something. And in many ways, they were right. Civilization has always depended on understanding the sky, planting crops, tracking seasons, navigating oceans, building calendars. The sky was humanity's first clock, and the Sumerians were among the first people to study it systematically. But there is still a mystery hiding inside those ancient tablets, because knowledge like this does not appear instantly. It grows slowly, across generations, across centuries. Yet the Sumerians seem to arrive suddenly in history with writing, cities, mathematics, astronomy, and detailed mythologies already in place, almost as if something had accelerated the process. Something had pushed civilization forward faster than expected. And that question leads directly to the final mystery of the tablets. Because if the Sumerians were recording history, and if the gods they described were meant to be remembered, then the tablets were not just myths. They were messages. Messages written for people who would come thousands of years later. For us. And if those messages were meant to be understood, then the final question becomes unavoidable. What exactly were they trying to tell us? For most of the 20th century, historians believed the mystery of the Sumerian tablets had been solved. The tablets were translated. The language was understood. The myths were categorized. And the strange stories they contained were placed neatly into the same box as every other ancient religion. Creation myths, flood myths, stories meant to explain the world before science existed. But something uncomfortable happened once scholars began translating more tablets. The stories became detailed, too detailed to dismiss easily. Thousands of tablets were excavated from cities like Nippur, Lagash, and Nineveh. They were written in cuneiform, pressed carefully into clay thousands of years ago, when the tablets were baked by the fires that destroyed these cities. They hardened, and that accident preserved them. Not fragments of legend, records, administrative lists, astronomical observations, kings, battles, trade, agriculture, mathematics. But scattered among those records were stories that sounded very different from ordinary mythology. Stories describing beings called the Anunnaki. The name appears again and again across different tablets and different cities. Sometimes they are described simply as gods. Other times, they are something more specific. Beings who came from the heavens. Beings who arrived on Earth before the rise of the first cities. Beings who ruled before human kings appeared. That is where the debate begins, because ancient mythologies everywhere talk about gods, but Sumerian tablets often describe these beings in strangely practical terms. They build cities, they divide land, they issue commands, They argue with one another. And most unusually of all, they leave. In several tablets, the Anunnaki are described as descending from the sky. Not metaphorically, literally. They are said to have come down from the heavens to establish order on earth. They teach agriculture. They teach writing. They teach law. And then they place humans under kings. For centuries, scholars interpreted these passages symbolically. The sky meant the divine realm. The descent of the gods meant the beginning of civilization. Simple, poetic, metaphorical. But a small group of researchers began asking a different question. What if the Sumerians meant exactly what they wrote? Because the Sumerians were not vague storytellers. They were meticulous record keepers. They measured the stars. They mapped the skies. They recorded lunar cycles and planetary movements. Some of their astronomical records are so precise that modern scientists can confirm them, which leads to a strange possibility. If their astronomical observations were real, and their historical records were real, then why assume their descriptions of the Anunnaki were imaginary? That question is where the entire mystery opens again. Not as a proven theory, but as a possibility. Because once you stop dismissing the texts as myth, you begin reading them very differently. And that is where the story becomes truly strange. Because some of the tablets do not describe gods who simply ruled. They describe gods who needed something from earth. 5,000 years ago, the cities mentioned in these tablets were the center of the world. Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Nineveh, cities of temples, canals, astronomers, and kings. Today, most people have never heard their names, but they still exist, not in legend, on maps. The ancient land the Sumerians called home was Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Today it lies largely within modern Iraq, with parts extending into Iran, Syria, Kuwait, and Turkey. The city of Ur, once a powerful Sumerian capital, now sits as ruins in southern Iraq, near the modern city of Nasiriyah. The great city of Uruk, where the legendary king Gilgamesh supposedly ruled, lies in the desert of southern Iraq, its ancient walls now silent beneath the sand. Nippur, once the sacred city of the god Enlil and a center of Sumerian religion, rests today near the Iraqi town of Nufar, about 200 kilometers south of Baghdad. And Nineveh, one of the largest cities of the ancient world, now lies beneath the outskirts of the modern Iraqi city of Mosul. These places are not mythical. They are real locations. You could drive to them today. Stand where the first writing on earth was pressed into clay. Stand where kings once claimed they ruled the world. Stand where the tablets describing the Anunnaki were first written. And that is what makes the mystery so powerful. Because the tablets are not legends written centuries later. They are contemporary records, written by the civilization that lived there, pressed into clay, buried, forgotten, then discovered again thousands of years later. Which leaves us with the question that refuses to disappear. Were the Sumerians simply telling stories, or were they trying to record something they believed had actually happened? Because if the oldest written civilization on Earth believed beings once came from the sky, then the real mystery is not why they wrote it. The real mystery is why they were so certain. For more than a century, archaeologists have been returning to the same narrow stretch of land: southern Iraq, northern Syria, the dry riverbeds of ancient Mesopotamia, the places where the first cities stood: Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nineveh. Satellite scans suggest that beneath the sand there may still be thousands of tablets waiting to be uncovered. Entire libraries, entire histories. Sometimes the excavations look almost military. Convoys crossing desert highways, heavy equipment rolling toward ancient ruins. Temporary research camps rising beside cities that vanished 5,000 years ago. Because every new tablet changes something. A name, a king, a fragment of knowledge that should not exist so early in human history. And each discovery leads to the same unsettling question. If the Sumerians were recording memories from the beginning of civilization, then how much of that world is still buried beneath the sand? And how many tablets have we simply not found yet?